Well, good afternoon, shipmates. Have we had fun yet? I think so. Well, well, it's been a great pleasure for us, Barbara and myself, to be with all of you aboard, and particularly I'm honored to be sharing a stage with our experts and great talent. And you always learn something out here in the middle of the ocean, which is, for me, was, when am I going to lose another hour of sleep? But if you like this ship and this great cruise and all the services, I recommend doing the same one but going west so you get an extra hour of sleep every so often. But you know, we're tough. We can relax to the point where, as they say, we get numb with pleasure and our cup of joy runneth over. So we'll just have to appreciate our time together, because now we're landing in the final destination, the great city of Lisbon. And I'm sure many of you have been there before. I've sailed in many a time, and I once ran aground within sight of the town, but they still let me in. And so, of course, the question on a ship like this, and you've heard the captain and the Jonathan and all the others in their positions, where when they had a time off, they start to get an argument between them. So who has the most important job on the ship? And so then they decide, well, on our day off when nobody's aboard, why don't we just trade our positions, see how we do? And so the captain is sent to the galley, and the chef is sent to the engine room. The engineer was put in charge of the theater here, and the cruise director was put up to the bridge. And so they call each other and say, well, how's it going? And the chef said, well, this is great. I never realized we had such large, warm ovens. I could cook a lot more in the engine room than in my tight little galley. And then the engineer up here in the theater said, this is much more complicated than running the rest of the ship, all these wires and lights and actions, and it's too difficult. And so then they called down to the captain in the galley, and he said, I can't believe you give the crew big knives like this. There could be a mutiny. And so then they call up for the cruise director, and they say, well, how's it going? Oh, just fine. Well, where are we? Well, I really don't know. I don't know how to find out where we are. But don't worry, we're safe. What do you mean we're safe? We ran aground, and the buses are ready. Well, anyway, I'm going to tell you about this beautiful city of Lisbon, which this is the Praça do Comércio, which is the great plaza right on the river near where we're docking. And of course, you know Portugal. Sorry, my clicker is not going here. At the end of Europe, it's all the way down from the great collection of nations, and we went off to the Azores, way out there, and now Madeira, which is closer, and we'll be in Lisbon soon. But this is a small country at the end of Europe, which meant it was often the most isolated, the one that was out of the main trade routes and such. So it was fairly simple from antiquity until the great age of exploration, which the Portuguese led, particularly after the conquest of Constantinople and the control of the Eastern Mediterranean trade by the Venetians. But over many centuries, the local places in Portugal were run by local families, subsistence agriculture, short sea fishing and things like that. So you may have been up to Porto and down to Navarre, and Lisbon is just, oh, my clicker is not working, but it's sort of central to the country. Then you go down to the Algarve and the entrance to the Mediterranean just below in Gibraltar. But a lot of it looks like this, a rugged coastline that has some rivers and some ports, but other than Lisbon, there's not really a very good bay or estuary for larger shipping. So Lisbon is really the commercial land, of course, the political capital. But if you've been around, many other places are very dramatic, especially on the shore. This is Cabo de Roca, and also Sagres. There are these other points of land on the rough Atlantic. The Algarve is the southern-facing coast toward Madeira and also toward the sunnier south coast of Spain. But here's a little view of Navarre, which is famous for its gigantic waves that get up to 30 more meters high as the ocean swells are narrowed into a sea canyon, and then they come to a short cliff of a beach and they produce this kind of action. So this is where surfers, and there may be a spot with them, this is sort of the Mount Everest of surfing, and people just go there to get on the lighthouse and watch the daredevils go out there and ride these waves. Well, that's a sport that I have survived, and I'm glad I'm in the grandstands now. But other parts of Portugal, you may have been up to Porto and the Douro Valley and places that there's lovely vineyards and lush countryside going up into the to the east of the rise until the Spanish border. Porto in particular is a beautiful little town with painted old fishing boats and houses, and it is the entranceway to the Douro Valley, and people go up there on a river trip and stay over and explore the wine country. But we are going to Lisbon, and Lisbon's been the capital for so many centuries because of its position on the mouth of the Tagus River, which has a whole bay and estuary inside of it. Now this is unusual because most bays open up, but the Tagus, which is the Latin name for the river, actually, we use it in English, Tejo in Portuguese. It's called an inverted delta because once you come in the narrow gap to the downtown Lisbon, then the bay opens up and it gets very broad. So it's very safe for shipping. You come in there, anchor, there's room, it's protected from ocean storms, and it was fortified with forts to keep the pirates out and such. But that river alone, the Tagus, comes from Guadalajara, Madrid, down to Toledo, all the way down to Lisbon. This is the longest river in the Iberian Peninsula. But it had also been traditionally a trading route, but above all, it was where political authority would be tried to expand from Madrid, and over the centuries, the Portuguese have always fought for their independence to not be just another province of Spain, particularly when it was reunified as a big empire. But this is what it looks like further up in Toledo, where it becomes above navigation and back country and such. But barges used to come down and come all the way to Lisbon through these narrow canyons and misty countryside. But as we go into the river and the harbor, the first thing we'll see is the Belém Tower, which is a beautiful watchtower, really an armed fortress with cannon and such to defend the river. But it's an architectural masterpiece of limestone work and these crenellations and watchtowers, but that is open to the public. You go on a bridge over to see it. So that's the first site. Then as we go toward the center city, you see the great modern monument to the explorers. So the various of the Vasco da Gama, Diaz, Cabral, Magellan, but it's led by Henry the Navigator, who was the sponsor of many of these expeditions. Then we come under the great April 25th Bridge, which was built in 1966 under the Salazar government and named after the military dictator who sponsored it. And then it was renamed the April 25th Bridge after the Carnation Revolution, which replaced the military government with the democratic government that remains in charge today. Then above the bridge, particularly at night, you see the great Corcovado, another Christ statue overlooking the whole city, just like in Rio de Janeiro. Well, when we come into the harbor, you can see how broad the river is already, and they have built out the embankment, so they have marinas and new development into the river, and we will be docking right past the center of the city, just to the right of this, like the Doca de Marinha. Then the cruise terminal is just near there, so we can actually walk off the ship and go walking into the classic center of Lisbon, one of the better landings of a ship. And so here it is, just the front development, which was put on landfill, and then in the background are the hills and the old neighborhoods, particularly Alfama. But it's very hilly city. After you come into the landing in the lower city, there's a hike up to hills in each direction. And so this is a view of the castle of St. George's Castle up above the old neighborhood. And I once stayed in an apartment right up there. It was quite a climb to get there. There's a funicular on one side, but this is the medieval center where the kings and the authority of the Portuguese government resided. Now it's all a public park, but a very dramatic medieval fortress. And this is at the main square again, down by the river, the Praça do Comércio. Used to be the big marketplace in medieval times until it became government offices. Now it is sort of the grand plaza for the city facing the river. And that fellow on the horses, King Zhao I, who was one of the principal leaders during the age of exploration. But if you can see it, he's stomping with his horse on the snakes of rebellion. But that's another story. When we go around, though, you can again, you see just on the right side, the cruise terminal. You can go down by the cathedral, then the plaza, then all these sites all through the town. And you go up into the Barrio Alto, which is up the hill that way. Alfama goes up to the castle. And then there's a vast city behind it. There are over 2 million people in this large metropolitan area now. But again, walking off the ship, you can go see the old medieval cathedral. It dates in the 1400s. And of course, it was lording over a city that was bustling with commerce and the plaza that remains. But I found this picture because it shows all of the different people coming from all kinds of places. I'm not sure what they're doing on the boat. One fellow's playing the tambourine while somebody is wooing somebody. And then there are traders and jugglers and performers and all kinds. It's sort of like a Bruegel-esque panorama of the medieval life. That neighborhood is called Alfama, which in Arabic means the baths, because it used to be hot, steaming Turkish-style baths through there. But it was also famous for being where the sailors, the merchants, everybody got together. And until recently, it was considered the poorest, most rundown, old part of town that nobody wanted to live there because it had terrible sanitation and had crime. But it also had the fado nightclubs and the women of the night and the things that were important to people back then. But now it's been cleaned up with restoration of the buildings and better facilities for the residents and a lot of places to go and shop and particularly to hear the night music. Just above that is the cathedral and the monastery grounds. And as you go further up here, you get more recent buildings, which are, this one features what they call Emmanuel light decorations, arabesque style, Moorish and Gothic windows and trim and a roof. So this is considered the high classic Portuguese architecture. The most famous and largest example is the monastery of San Geronimo, which is further down the river. And this was a religious monastery for many years. Now it's a museum and has many historical items in it. But again, it has this beautiful, almost filigree Gothic construction, which is particularly, let's say, not very pretentious, I guess. You know, a lot of big buildings don't have such subtlety on their decoration. So there are quite a few of them. This is now another government office. So as you go around downtown, you see this, the pride of the Portuguese Empire at the time that made Lisbon one of the richest cities in Europe because it had spice trade, all kinds of other goods from both the Americas and Asia, all came through Lisbon. There was a big building called the Casa de India, which was the counting house for all of the goods and services, often taxed quite a bit before they got distributed, so that this meant that the Lisbon and the royal and the noble merchant class became quite wealthy and built these palaces around Lisbon. This is the Palace of the Marquesa de Frontiera Azuelos. The Azuelos are the blue tiles. You must have seen them many places. They're in Madeira, everywhere in Portugal. So that's the classic decoration for buildings both inside and outside. Then as you go up into the hills, you go into the neighborhoods, which are pretty steep climbs. So Portugal has, for a century or more, had electric trams that go up these hills. So for a couple of euros, you can just go and ride them up in the neighborhood and come all the way down, save you a bit of a hike. Unfortunately, there are no toboggans, but here's one of them. Then if you go up even higher to the, what they call the Alto, the high city, they built these elevators, which are sort of wrought iron works of wonder, sort of like an Eiffel Tower for Portugal, for Lisbon, and there are 2 or 3 of them. And they even have them in other places like Rio de Janeiro and other Portuguese countries. But then you come up into a neighborhood that has stately apartment blocks and far better accommodations than down in the lowland. And so if you go up there, you can walk on all these streets and see, let's say, the spreading modernization of Lisbon. You know, these buildings are maybe only 50 to 100 years old, but still built in a kind of a stately style, and always with a plaza, always with plenty of fresh air and room in the city. Up at the top of, from the low city up to the mid-levels, they call it, there's this fantastic fountain that flows down in what could be called a kind of a central park for the whole city. And this goes all the way down to the old town. So this is a remarkable kind of stretch of green right in the center of the city. Other sites further over include this one, which is the Campo Pequeño. It was built in the Middle Ages and then rebuilt many times as the bullfighting ring. And now they're not bullfighting there. They have the rock and roll concerts and other important cultural events there. But the life of Lisbon is largely in the neighborhoods and in the cafes. So this is like many other city. The culture is really out on the street, in the neighborhood with different people. And Lisbon, because it never had the damage of World War II or other troubles, it's preserved some of these for 100 or more years. I don't know what the oldest one is, but this is one called the Pavilha Chinas. So it is a coffee shop, pastry, light snack meal, but it's famous for having collections of all kinds of stuff that have been either bought or left there, perhaps. And so you go into the main room, if you can get a reservation or walk in, and you can see there are cabinets with all kinds of knickknacks from around the world and toy soldiers, and here's a whole room dedicated to airplane models and flags and this sort of paraphernalia that makes it an interesting place to go and look around. Well, the most famous of the, what you'd say in French, a flâneur, someone who hangs out in the coffee shop and gossips and writes about life, it was the poet-writer Fernando Pessoa. And he lived a short life and died at 43, but he spent much of his life in these cafes. Here's a picture of him at one of them. And he'd drink all day and smoke all day and talk all day and write such. And so he wrote many very pithy things that in Portuguese mean a lot to the local people. And so he was said that he felt like he was at the center of everything where there is nothing. And he wrote under many pseudonyms, so his writings are extensive, but he would change his personality and his way of writing, and then and people said, well, why don't you just stick to one name? The name Pessoa means person, so he was sort of Mr. Anonymous in that way. In the literary tradition, he didn't copyright or keep things. He sold and made a bit of a living as a journalist, but when he was criticized for being so inconsistent, he answered, because God has no unity, how can I? And so he called himself living in the shadow and the invisible man. Well, one of the places that he frequented very much is near the Barrio Alta, by that elevator from the downtown, called the Café Brasileira, which was a coffee shop that dated from the 1850s or so. And it now has the street side cafe, but they put up a statue of him so he could keep taking notes there for the people who come by. His family inherited from his crammed apartment some 30 lockers of handwritten notes, which they're still trying to decipher what he was talking about. But he's the mystery man of Lisbon. And here's one of his sayings from his poem, The Portuguese Sea, which I recited last week or so. But in Portuguese, under the statue of Henry the Navigator, he says, Valeu a pena, toda vale a pena, se a alma não é pequena. Pardon my Portuguese, but it says, what is worth the pain of work, love, life itself? He said, everything is worth the pain because your spirit is not small. You are big enough and you are confident enough to live in spite of your pains. Well, this is a theme in Lisbon in general, the sadness, the longing, the missing of people, particularly sailors and people who would leave their home in Portugal and their families and never return. So the fado, which you may have heard the other night with that great singer in Madeira, is the classic music of Lisbon. And you've already heard. So it has a 10-string Portuguese guitar. And it's usually sung by a woman for the longing and missing of her loved ones. It's always in a minor key. Occasionally a man sings, but it's really a woman's lament, the whole tradition of it. And then it has a lot of commentary leading it to have been banned by the Salazar military as critical of the regime back then. So only recently has it been allowed to be performed live in public in Lisbon and of course around the world now. But it's been described as Portugal has a certain amount of pleasure in their own unhappiness, and that's saudade. Well, there are other traditions around Portugal. I'll just show a couple of pictures of festivals because Portugal actually has a patchwork of different areas that all have their own saints' days and processions and embroideries and ceramics. So it's if you've been around Portugal, every place is very interesting. And I undoubtedly you'll see the rooster, which is the symbol of Portugal. And the story is from a medieval tale of a pilgrim going to San Compostela up in Galicia, and the poor pilgrim was accused of thievery and taken to a judge who was having dinner, and the judge said, no, we kill thieves, take them to be hung, and the pilgrim said, no, I am innocent by the word of God, you have to believe me, because if you don't, that rooster will complain and get up and crow, the rooster being cooked right in front of the judge. And there are many versions of the story, but the man was, as he was getting strung up, the rooster on the table started to crow, and so then the judge sent word to let him go. But that's a symbol of good luck in Portugal. Well, the history goes back, I'll give you some review of it, to Neolithic, prehistory, Celtic peoples, Neanderthals, and particularly they have these standing dolmens in some parts of northern Portugal, including even a dolmen lentil grave from unknown people for an unknown time. But this was part of the Celtic culture that came all the way from British Isles, Scotland, down to western France, Galicia, down to Portugal. So this particular, they think it was a gravestone with these kind of designs that continue in the iconography of art day. But then the invasion started. Most principally, the Phoenicians came from the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean, came all the way and set up Carthage, and they were in Sicily, all these places. But you see, they also founded the city of Lisbon in maybe 800 BC, but there are only scattered remains, no written record. But on this pot, there is the Phoenician alphabet, which is the basis of the Latin alphabet, so we still use it. Then Portugal was part of the Roman Empire, and Portugal was then called Lusitania in Latin. Galicia is the northern part of this vast territory that the Romans nominally conquered. But you still find in the old towns ruins of baths and tile work and different castles and things that were built during this medieval and ancient times. And then the people of Portugal had, let's say, no sense of nationhood, and all of the areas had their own version of vulgar Latin that turned into Spanish and Portuguese. But it was said that the Portuguese down on the coast, they would always change the words so that nobody from the upland would understand what they're talking about. So that's still a problem, because if you're a Spanish speaker, when you try to speak Portuguese, it just doesn't come out right, and they have a great sense of propriety for their Portuguese. And so it also goes around the world with the Portuguese Empire, notably Brazil. But meanwhile, the groups got together and they fought the Moors and the caliphate, the Islamic caliphate that had taken over in the medieval era. And it was this knight, Alfonso Henriques, who unified the Portuguese to fight the Moors, who were not Arab, they were Berber, and like Morocco. The Moors really mean the Moroccans, whatever ethnicity. But this great battle of the Crusades and to drive the Muslims out of Spain and Portugal was led by the nobles and the armies of the time. So Alfonso was the Duke of Braganza, and that became the royal family of Portugal until recently. And this is a curious cartoon I found of the king sleeping on his family tree, wondering what would happen next. But for hundreds of years there were battles. So from Barcelona to Lisbon and down in Murcia and Toledo, they all had their battles. But in Lisbon they had a major siege, including allies of the Portuguese who happened to be Norsemen from Normandy. And so 1147, the castle and the city walls of Lisbon were breached, and the Moors surrendered and left town. There's still some remnant population. Many of the mosques were turned into churches and things. Then the battles continued. It was either the Spanish or the French trying to conquer either Lisbon or other parts of Portugal. And so the history is just one battle after another in attempts to control, except that led to a very militaristic tradition in Portugal, from ancient crusaders down to the current era, which is the presidential guard on horseback. Now, Portugal had other troubles following, but it became a major city because of its facing the sea and having this good harbor, but above all, it became a shipbuilding center. So versus the ships on the North Sea or in the Mediterranean, the Portuguese developed the great caravel, they called, which was, as you've seen, a heavy, broad beam, slow sail ship that could get across the oceans and come back with the many goods. And so even Lisbon has been described as a city that is the wife of the sea with the body of a caravel, but the heart of a war frigate. And so when Portugal decided to build these fleets and go exploring, and Portuguese sailors had already been out and found the Azores, Madeira, all the way to fishing off of Newfoundland and Labrador. The Canadian province of Labrador is worker in Portuguese, so they would send people all the way there for cod fishing. Meanwhile, Manuel declared an empire with this symbol of Europa in her birthday suit and the unknown natives from around the world. But it was his second son, the Infante Principe, who set up this school of navigation in Sagres. Can you hear me? And he sponsored navigation studies, shipbuilding, chart making, and so then he personally sponsored of the royal funds, Vasco da Gama, Diaz, Cabral, all these Portuguese who went to Brazil, went to South Africa, finally culminating in the voyage of Vasco da Gama. Here he is in Malindi, which is now part of Tanzania, getting an Arabic navigator to take him to India. And so within a few generations, the Portuguese Empire spread from their small country to all these spots around the world, from Brazil to Cape Hope, the Indian Ocean. These were not landed colonies as much as they were fortified trading posts. And so for lack of, let's say, lots of settlers, they would have a military command and merchant ships come and carry the trade all the way from Brazil all the way to the Far East. So again, Malacca, Macau, Nagasaki. I showed this the other day. The Japanese painting of the Portuguese arriving in the harbor of Nagasaki. So this is sort of a very interesting picture again, because here they brought an elephant from Africa. They had slaves from Africa. This was also the time when the slave trade was, well, there had always been a slave trade, but the House of Braganza set up formal markets and commercial funding for the slave trade, and over 2 million were sent to Brazil. Others, North America received a minority of the enslaved, but then everywhere they went, they would take slaves. I mentioned Magellan's manservant Enrique had been enslaved in Malacca. Well, that was the way of the time, but back in Lisbon, the conflict with Spain was still always present, because the Spanish had been battling them. Then by dynastic merging of marriage, Philip II became the king of both Spain and Portugal. And you can read the details of the gossip and the intrigues of the time, but Catherine de' Medici from Italy married Henry II of France, and then was the godmother of many other royal house, including Portugal and Spain. And so it came down to this woman, Catarina Duquesa de Braganza, who had an arranged marriage with Charles II of England. And he was said, she spoke no English. She was a Catholic. She was sort of a mystic and a shrewd character who was implicated in various plots. But King Charles himself said, "Who sent me this bat of a woman?" And so she's the first bat woman in history. But curiously, the Portuguese community in New York City wanted to honor her with a statue. And so when this was proposed and went to hearing, some pesky historian said, "Oh, well, she was one of the principals in the Portuguese slave trade." So the council voted the statue away, and now it overlooks Lisbon on the river. We can go by and see her. But meanwhile, Lisbon grew tremendously because of its overseas trade. And these are pictures of the Praça de Comércio when it was a trading grounds, with the Casa India behind it and the palace and the castle up there. And it was also the site of public entertainment like the Inquisition. But then one day in 1755, December 8th, I believe it was, there was an earthquake and a fire, and then a tsunami destroyed the whole center city. So this was one of the great cataclysms of the era. And some people say, well, this is the wrath of God for all the sins of the Portuguese rulers. But it was actually a natural event that just left everything that they had treasured in ruins. And so now it's been largely rebuilt, of course, except they left one convent, the Carmo, which again in the upper city you can go visit as a reminder of that tragedy for Lisbon. So then the Marquis de Pombal was engaged and financed as an architect and an urban designer to rebuild the old town and make it more glorious than it used to be. And here he is on a pedestal up in his park up above the city, overlooking the lower town that was rebuilt in a grid form so that it was compact and useful. And he also rebuilt the great plaza. So you can get off the ship, walk right up here, walk all the way up to the park if you wish. But that area has lots of little shops and hotels and things, so it's very much the urban center of the old city. And this is the triumphal arch that they built at the time. So some of these buildings are still here, though, that they rebuilt. For instance, this is one of the main post office. So they built it even grander, let's say. That's what we'll see today. And the Braganza dynasty continued on until Carlos I, who was called the Ocean king because he started oceanography on his own private ships and wanted to survey the seas and things like that, sort of like Prince Renier in Monaco. But one day in 1908, anarchists attacked his carriage and killed him and his older son. And this was part of the agitation, anti-royalist movement of that era and in Portugal. But his second son, Manuel II, at age 18, took the throne, was crowned, and then he really didn't know what to do. He was a teenager. And one of his advisors said, we regret that you were so young in such an old country in a difficult time. But the Republican movement was unstoppable, and even they wanted the royal family wanted to become a constitutional monarch, but the assembly, the Cortes they call it, refused. And there's turmoil because of the Great Depression, all this, where the military took over under General Gomez in 1926, and that remained the government as sort of a precedent for Franco in Spain until the uprising in 1974. But this is a view of the great Central Plaza back then. The real problem is that Portugal had taken these colonies around the world. There's a little one, Guinea in Africa, West Africa, Angola, Mozambique, plus their settlements all the way to Asia, plus Brazil, which became independent. And with the upheavals of the world after World War II and the mandate to decolonize these places, the Portuguese military government refused and tried to fight the millions of people that they had in their colonies, which was, they could not afford it. They had no allies. The UN and others would not support them. And so again, there was a political upheaval and a military coup that then reestablished the democratic rule under the system they have now, parliamentary system with a prime minister, et cetera. But that's the Carnation Revolution, where the military came in, they put flowers in the guns, and they declared liberty. Here's a monument to it down to the east of the downtown, but it's sort of both looks ancient and very modern at the same time, like the new mosque from 1999. It looks like some sort of Babylonian ziggurat or something, but not really terribly Islamic. But they've reconciled those conflicts in the past, and now there's religious freedom and a diverse population, especially from the former colonies. So you'll hear a lot of African-speaking Portuguese in the streets of Lisbon. Meanwhile, they redeveloped a lot, particularly to the east of downtown, and they have what they call the Water City with promenades and beaches and playgrounds. And so this is modern Lisbon, which is, of course, a reflection of our times, while the old has been preserved and remembered. But the city is very big. They do have a good metro system and taxis and all. You can go around and see these places. But this is the new era of architecture in particular, new library for one of the universities. And this is also a new train station, which with high-speed rail you can get all over Europe relatively quickly nowadays. So the life in Lisbon goes on, particularly in the temple of, what do they call that? Oh, the religion of football. Yes, there we go. All right. Well, I think they're waiting for the World Cup to come here again. Meanwhile, Lisbon and Portugal as a nation have been a leader in diplomatic work, and Simon's talk about NATO includes Portugal, but above all, they try to get consensus among all the European leaders. So this is the signing of the Lisboa Treaty a number of years ago, which then codified many of the developments for the European Union. And then they sponsor many commercial gatherings and such. But I'll go back to the symbol of the city, which is the explorers. And again, Henry the Navigator up there, and the maybe willing sailors that went around the world. I talked about Magellan the other day, and a saying that is about the Portuguese exploration is that they have a small country to be born in, but a great world to die in. So many left Lisbon and other ports in Portugal, never came back, but discovered the world that we know now. And that sense of spirit is still within the Portuguese. One writer said, we Portuguese have a tendency for megalomania and adventure, even though we are very humble. Well, we're not sure what you are at the time. But Magellan's name went on, including naming this constellation in the southern hemisphere, the Magellanic Cluster of Galaxies, which is for celestial navigation is an important site along with the Southern Cross. And so Magellan is sort of the most dramatic and tragic of all the Portuguese explorers. This is a statue of him in Punta Arenas, Chile. And the saying, traditional saying, navegar é preciso, vivir não é preciso. To navigate is necessary, required, but not living is not required, because you may die on your journey, but you will have accomplished your mission, which Magellan may have done, I would say, though he never came home and never got the reward that he thought he earned. But I'll leave you another saying of T.S. Eliot: only those who risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. Nowadays, I showed some of the Portuguese European Space Agency efforts and all that, but that's all very scientific and bureaucratic and funded and all, but I was looking for some explorer who personifies that spirit of the Portuguese. I had a friend in Lisbon here that I was going to go see, but he answered me back. He said, I'm on my boat off of Brazil. I'm going around the world, but now that I'm in Brazil, what's my hurry? And it won't make news, but I have another friend who sailed this hand-built ferro-cement schooner around the world for over 1,100 days as the world's longest journey without stopping on land or reprovisioning. He would harvest the sea, meaning he'd fish, get water from the rain on his sails, and he had a hydroponic garden and could live out there forever, he said, with his mate Sonia. And then he made the longest journey in world history, and he has that kind of manic determinism to do this anyway, in spite of all the advice against it. And he sailed out of New York Harbor with this big Polynesian tiki god on the front of his schooner, and within 3 days he was ran down by some large vessel and took the whole front of the boat off. Did not damage the hull. So he spent a month out there bobbing around, repairing it himself with Sonia. Then he continued all the way around the world 3 or 4 times without stopping. And so he endured all the troubles and the pleasures of the sea, but he thought that if humans can live on a ship that long, and not the crowded old ones or the lovely modern ones like this, that this is an analog to go into space. And so he, in the last number of years, has been writing manuals and instructions on how do you go for 3 or more years at a time, like the time it would take to go to Mars, and have the camaraderie, the supplies, the communications. And so he set up a company to do training on sailing vessels out in the middle of the ocean as a Mars analog training, which is something NASA and the European Space Agency do, usually in a box on some place where there's no fresh air, much less fresh fish. But in recent months, he's been tapped to be whether he wants to go on the first flyby with SpaceX. So he's always just sort of waiting for Elon Musk to answer his phone call. And this is an illustration he made with his own schooner. Not that it's going to be like that, but he says he'll go one way, he doesn't have to get paid, he doesn't have to come back, as sort of a symbol of exploration. I'll leave you with the last couple of quotes here. This one actually started in Phoenician, it came into Latin from Horace, but it says, "Those who run across the sea do not change their souls," meaning you should have patience if you go to sea, and you should either endure it or enjoy it, but don't be in a hurry. And I think we've had enough relaxation on this ship to last us for a while. But I would recommend, if you're going to truly change your soul at sea, don't look up the news. But anyway, I'll leave you with a couple more sayings of my mentor, James Kirk, of the Starship Enterprise. The prejudices we feel toward other people usually disappear when we get to know them. And from Isaac Dennison, the cure for anything is salt water. sweat, tears, or sea. And the time spent at sea does not add to one's age until you get ashore. And then Disraeli famously said, "I saw more than I remember, and remember more than I saw." And one more from our sailor colleague Columbus, "And the sea will grant new hope and bring dreams of home." And I wish you a good trip home, and it's my great pleasure to be out here on this beautiful, beautiful ship, and bon voyage. Thank you very much.